Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining MSAA's live webinar, Your Role in MS Improvements in Care, Demystifying Clinical Trials with Dr. Leorah Freeman and Alejandra Gomez. My name is Kate Durack. I am the Director of Communication and Patient Focus in the MSIN program for MSAA. I myself have been living with MS for 10 years, and I'm honored to be your host for this program. In case this is your first time joining an MSAA webinar, I would like to share information about MSAA and review housekeeping items. MSAA is a national nonprofit organization dedicated to improving lives today through vital services and support for the MS community. Our initiatives are designed to advance educational, wellness, and supportive resources. Our free programs and services include a national helpline, equipment and cooling distribution program, educational programs, award-winning publications, shared management tools, and a peer-to-peer online forum. For more information about all of that, please feel free to visit us at mymsaa.org. And then just a couple of reminders for tonight. During tonight's program, you will have the opportunity to submit your questions by using the Q&A chat box. And then as time permits, questions will be addressed during the Q&A portion of tonight's webinar. Also, please know that this program is being recorded and will be available as an on-demand video on our MSA's video library in the next few weeks. And then at the end of the program, we ask that you please complete a brief survey. Your feedback is extremely important and it helps us develop future content and programs. And a link to that survey will be included in the chat box. And then finally, as a friendly reminder, this program is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute formal recommendations. Please speak with your care team regarding specific questions or concerns. All right, and with that, we're ready to dive in. This evening, we are discussing a topic that can sometimes feel intimidating or mysterious, and that's clinical trials. For many people living with MS, including myself at one point, the idea of participating in research can bring up a mix of emotions like curiosity, uncertainty, and hope. And our goal tonight is to break things down and make the process more approachable so that you can better understand how clinical trials contribute to improving MS care and how you might play a part. I am absolutely thrilled to be joined by Dr. Leorah Freeman, who is a neurologist and MS specialist and brings a wealth of experience in both clinical care and research, and Alejandra Gomez, who is a clinical research coordinator and works directly with people living with MS to guide and support their participation in clinical trials. Together tonight, they'll share insights from both sides of the experience, what research really is, what it's like for participants, how to become involved, and what it all means for the future of MS treatment and care. And hopefully by the end of the session, we hope that you'll walk away feeling more informed about your role and how you can play a part in advancing MS research and care. And with that, I'm going to close our slides and get started.
Thank you so much, Kate, for having us. I'm really excited to talk with everyone, and just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight and hearing more about research. It's really a topic that is close to my heart, and I hope we get to share a little bit of the joy that we have in working in people, not just clinically, but through these different trials that advance the field.
Yeah, so happy to have you. You too, Ale. What a joy.
Yes.
I actually get to work with these two on a pretty regular basis, so I'm happy to have this conversation in particular. I have quite a few questions for the two of you tonight, so we're going to do it kind of as a Q&A format. And my first question is very general, and that is for Leorah, what is clinical research? And then what is a clinical research study or trial?
Yeah, that's the best way to start. So, I mean, what we call clinical research is really research that involves human participants, and we mean this broadly, either people who don't have a specific condition or people who live with a specific condition. And this is research that addresses specific question about health and disease. So this is very broadly kind of the definition of clinical research. Now you ask kind of what is, a clinical trial? And often people think when we talk about clinical research, people think about clinical trials, which are a subtype of clinical research. They're research studies that are testing, where researchers are testing whether a specific medical approach, meaning a treatment or some kind of therapy or intervention, is effective in a specific context of a disease. So that can be testing a drug for MS, that can be testing a specific lifestyle intervention, exercise program for spasticity. That can be many different things that we try, but it always involves an intervention.
That's awesome. And so my next question to dive a little bit deeper is, can you talk to us about what phases are in clinical research and trials?
Yeah, so I mean, first let's take kind of more broadly, like kind of what exists within clinical research. I think that's kind of important,
Yeah.
because we talked about interventional studies, and that's like one subtype where we test those new treatments or those new interventional strategies. But there are also different, types of clinical research, some that are not interventional at all, where we're not
Mhm.
testing a new intervention or a new drug, for example, where we're just observing patients over time to look at their outcomes. There are also types of research that is more qualitative, where we have an interest in how people feel or what is their experience with the disease. There are also some research that is focused on how care is delivered. So that's what we call health services research, for example. And then we talk probably a little bit about that more later, but there's also implementation research, which is the different subtypes. So that's kind of like different things that are under this big umbrella of clinical research. Now, when we talked about clinical phases, trial phases, and we talked specifically about those interventional studies, when we're testing particularly new medications, we do this in phases because you can imagine that it would be quite unsafe to think about testing a new drug and all of a sudden putting thousands of people on it and just seeing what comes out, right? So we have to proceed in phases to make sure that the new medication or intervention first is safe, and that's usually the phase one, where we test this new, usually medicine, on a small group of people who are healthy volunteers, and we just see, is it even safe to put human beings on this treatment? Then we move, if that proves this to be safe, then we move to phase two. In phase two, we take people who live with the condition we want to treat, and we take a slightly larger group of them, and we see in this, slightly larger group of people living with this condition if the intervention or treatment is effective. If we pass phase two, that's when we do the big trial. And that big trial is going to involve hundreds and sometimes thousands of people living with MS or another condition in different locations, most of the time, different sites. And we put all these people on this new treatment, often against the standard of care, either placebo or in MS, most often it is a standard other treatment. And then we compare the two arms to see if the new treatment, the new approach, is more effective. And that's usually that's what we call the big pivotal trial. And that's usually what pharma company, after they've done this big phase three trial, that's what allows them to go to the FDA and say, here, we have this big, this new treatment we've tested. We want to have it approved. Here are our results. And that's what leads to the approval by the FDA. After the medication is approved, then we move on to phase four, which is a post-marketing phase, where we conduct multiple different studies to look at safety elements or effectiveness in different subgroups, things that were hard to evaluate in the big trial, but where we can do more focused or, in-depth study. An example, for example, would be studies that look at medication in the context of breastfeeding. We can't do that in the big phase three trial. But once the drug is on the market, we can design studies that allow us to do that safely with the marketed medication. So that's what phase four is. So usually when people participate in trial, the most common ones that they would be asked to participate are usually those phase three and four, because that's where we need the most participants. But they may be option as well for participating in phase two.
Leora, what does the structure look like, or what can be the differences be in research if you don't go through the phases because you're not studying a specific treatment or drug? I mean, what are the other options for that?
Yeah, so the other options is, sometimes we follow similar phases for, let's say, an intervention that's not a drug. We might start with a smaller trial, look at safety and effectiveness in a smaller group, and then do a bigger trial that's more validating and multicentric. But again, as I mentioned earlier, you may have, also research that doesn't test intervention, but that's also highly valuable. And, some, big ones is observational study where we enroll participants, in a study where we're going to track their outcome. For instance, let's say we want to look at all the outcome of people who are taking this medication. So we do an observational study to just see how they're doing. Or we want to understand the outcomes of people with MS who are above a certain age, and understand how older adults are doing in the real world with the disease. And those observational studies are really powerful to really look at the real world outcomes, because
Yeah.
sometimes, those big studies and trials, they're just more, structured and organized, but in the real world, we know that people behave differently. Maybe they don't take their medications all the time. Maybe things happen in their lives in addition to, what we're testing. So that's really allow us to understand like real people in the real world and how they're functioning and doing, for example.
I feel like that's super interesting for MS, the observational study piece, because if you're doing really well on your treatment, but you still want to help in some way, it's nice to know that you can still be part of something like that and have an impact on MS care. So that's,
100%, because this often a misconception. It's like, well, I'm on a treatment that works for me, then I cannot do research.
mhm.
Well, no, there are plenty of other types of research that you can participate in, even if you're already on a treatment that works for you. You don't have to do drug research. You can help validate a biomarker. You can help participate in a patient registry where we're going to track your outcomes over time, and that's going to help us understand, how people like you can be, can do in the real world. Or you can, for example, be in research where we send you surveys to understand your experience at a more individualized and personal level. So there's many options for people who want to participate in research.
I'm going to circle back to a word that you just used, Leora, and that's biomarker. Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, so a biomarker in a very quickly is it's a way that we measure kind of the biology of disease. What we call biomarkers can be different things. They can be blood tests that we do that allow us to measure a certain phenomenon in the body. Sometimes we also call things like digital biomarkers when we track people's outcomes using applications on their phone. That's what people now have called digital biomarkers. There are imaging biomarkers where MRI, particularly in MS, allow us to measure certain processes that happen in the body of people with MS. So those biomarkers are kind of indicator of how the disease is doing in individual patients, and they have to also be kind of validated using research. We, for instance, many of the people who listen right now have probably heard about the new MS diagnostic criteria and these new MRI markers like the central vein sign. Well, our team was part of a big kind of national, group that has been studying the central vein sign for the last 7 years, where we have, successively done like pilot study and then larger study to validate its utility in diagnosing MS more accurately and in a more timely fashion. So this is their research like that where you kind of validate these new tests.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for explaining that more. I am going to pivot to Ale so that you can chime in as well. And I am going to ask you another general question. What does a clinical research coordinator do? What does your day-to-day look like?
Yes, so that is me. I am a clinical research coordinator. And as a clinical research coordinator, my main role is to be the bridge between the participant, the physician, and the study sponsor. So whoever's kind of running the study. And I help guide the patient through every single step of the process. And that really begins from the second I usually go in and pitch the study and explain it to them in a clinic room and answer any questions that they may have, to the next step being consenting the patient, if they do decide to be part of the study, enrolling them, and kind of running any sort of assessment or questionnaire that might be required in that first study visit. Apart from that, for a study visit, usually I will also take care of taking the patient to any MRIs or any lab testing, any sort of physical assessments with either just me, another coordinator, or sometimes even the provider themselves as well. I am also in charge of scheduling any sort of follow-up study visit, answering any questions, sending emails, being the main point of contact for the study for the patient. And I would say that I think for myself, my primary goal as a coordinator is always to be a safe space for the patient where they can always bring questions to me and reach out if they have any questions regarding the study or their own health or anything that they want relayed to their physician. I always want to make participants feel comfortable and safe and like they can come to us. So, kind of just the main point for most of the things in the study, I would say.
That's great. Thank you. What does it look like when it happens remotely?
We usually offer telehealth remote options. So just like you can see your provider usually in a telehealth visit, the same goes for research. So we usually have either an encrypted and safe Zoom setup for that, where we can come in and tell you about the study and then consent you virtually and even enroll you there and then virtually. So it's almost always an option. I think it really depends on the study. But it's really cool because sometimes it can make the research a lot lower maintenance for the participant without having to drive to the clinic or do a bunch of follow-up appointments that take up time. So that is almost always an option.
So, Ollie, how do I find out if there's a you at my office? Because I honestly have no idea.
Well, honestly, I think the first step is always just to ask. I think when a clinic or a specific university is a part of a study, there will usually be clinical research coordinators there at the clinic or on site. And they'll come into your appointment randomly, or usually your provider will ask if you're interested in hearing about research. And if you say yes, then we just pop in, introduce ourselves, introduce the study. And like I said, we'll give you all the information, flyers, any info we might have, and it is up to you to decide to enroll right then and there or take it home and reach out to us and then schedule something with us. But you can always ask your provider if there's something running in your clinic that you might be fit for. There's always other resources like the MSAA and nonprofits and things like that that you can look into their websites, and you can usually get on mailing lists or just look at what's on there to for you to be reached out to in case a new study opens up.
Awesome. Thank you. Now I'm going to switch over to a question about what a patient registry is. This is for Leorah. So the three of us are actually working on a project called MSIN, and the first thing that we're doing is creating a patient registry, and that's so that we can dig deeper into data soon. So Leorah, if you could explain what a patient registry is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if I might just add a word, to what Ale said, because I think it's really critical, is, you know, clinical research coordinators are really a part of the care team. And I see this play out every day, in our practice because we do so much research that, our patients feel so supported by our research staff. So really it's important to do as she says and reach out to your clinicians if you haven't been involved in research, because you may have access to fantastic folks like Ale, that can be a part of your team. So just wanted to highlight that. So yeah, let's shift gear to kind of what a patient registry is. So a patient registry is it's an organized system through which researchers collect kind of uniform longitudinal data on people that have a specific condition, like MS. Like as part of the MSIN, we're inviting our participants to be a part of the MSIN registry. And through that, we're collecting, patient surveys. We're also asking our participants to share their, not just their medical history, but also their electronic health records, allowing their clinicians to share information about them, so that this data can be kind of collected over time. And through that, we are able to understand, as I highlighted earlier, real world outcomes. We can also sometimes interrogate registry to understand safety of certain treatments, to understand quality of care, to understand the treatment patterns that patients follow, some of the challenges that people experience, complications. So registry can serve as the basis for learning about a condition and can often be interrogated to spur some hypotheses. Sometimes, like there are a lot of registries, they have been, several registries in MS. And sometimes when researchers have a question, sometimes they start with a registry and they're like, well, I'm going to interrogate this registry to see if my hypothesis may be correct. So for instance, I think that, people who eat a Mediterranean diet tend to have better outcomes. Instead of designing a whole new study, then patient registry allow us to have some of that data available, for example, if it's designed in a certain way, and then we can interrogate that. And then from that information that we have from the registry, then we can go on and design an additional research study that's going to go more in depth, or it's going to focus on an intervention. So it's a wealth of information for folks. So what it involves in a day-to-day for people, so they might, at our clinic, for example, they might meet with, if we have a registry going on, that we want to recruit them for, they meet with Alejandra and, and she, talks to them about what's involved, kind of surveys, how often are they going to receive survey, how are they going to receive them, what kind of data are we going to ask them to share. And then, when they are part of it, then they may receive, an email or text messages reminding them to fill their survey every now and then, or we may connect them to a different system through which they can share their health data, and that's collected kind of longitudinally in the long term to have insights into those long-term outcomes.
That's great. So, Ale, let's say I'm at my appointment and you come in and you explain that you're trying to get me to become part of a registry, and I am all in, except that I want to keep my name out of the whole thing.
Yeah.
How does that work? What does it look like on the back end, and how do you keep my data safe?
Yeah, so I think data safety is always something people want to know about. And to answer that first question is that most studies, if not all, de-identify all patient information. So what that means is that when you decide to join the study or this registry and give your health data, your name is stripped off of it. Any kind of identifiers, maybe it's like your date of birth or your medical ID, anything like that is taken off. So that's what it's called, de-identification. But in terms of data safety also, I think it's also really good to know that in any research study or clinical research trial, every study must be first reviewed by the IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board. And that is what that consists of, is a group of experts and community members who make sure that the study is ethical and participant rights are protected and all that sort of stuff. And so any study that might be offered to you always has to be approved by that first. Apart from that, there is always an informed consent process. So there will be an informed consent form always handed to you, and something that we will walk through with you that'll explain all of the data protections, the encryption, the de-identifying of the data, things like that. Like I said, also registries and all this information is usually kept in encrypted surveys. So your information is extremely safe and protected. Only people with very specific access to the data can see it. So not anyone can just pull that data if they want. Even coordinators or anyone that's part of the study is being observed, and they can't just do whatever they want with your data. So generally, or most of the time, everything is very, very, very safe. And of course, there's always a risk for data breaches and things like that, like with anything, but those are very, very slim. And in the case of that, your information is usually just information not tied to your name.
Good to know. So then, what about, as we're talking about protection and data, it's got me thinking about the physical protection. So what if I opt into a trial and I'm trying a new treatment?
Yeah.
What do you do to make sure that I'm still healthy and safe during that?
Yeah, of course. So first of all, being a part of any clinical research trial always means that you're going to be very carefully monitored. And I think that always, of course, depends on the study. If, you're just filling out surveys here and then and things like that. Maybe you're not coming in to see us as often or even in person, but in studies where you are more involved, or have more concerns, we're always checking in with you, whether that be via appointments that we set with you every 3 months, every 6 months. We're always, like I said, in reach for a call or an email or anything like that. Depending on the study, sometimes when you're coming in for a study visit, we're running tests on you. So that might be just neurological exams, physical exams, like a walk exam, cognition exams, and things like that, where your physician will be given that data or be present at the study and can notice if there's any sort of difference in your disease or any progression or anything to note. And they will always be the ones that circle back to you if necessary, or the ones that give us the information to give to you in terms of that. So you're always very much looked over and protected, and there's always a great line of communication in a study.
Yeah,
Thank
and it's
you.
important to remember, Kate, what we talked about earlier when we're talking about drug trials. This is something that is very codified. We have phases that look at, safety signals, in first in healthy controls and in smaller group of people living with the disease before going to larger group. And that is so that we can learn as we go what are safety signals that may pop up. And so by the time we're designing the big study where a lot of people are going to be subject to that drug or intervention, then we know a lot more already about potential safety concerns. And we can, when the study protocol is being designed, they are safeguards, tests that are going to be ordered at regular intervals, blood tests or others that are going to allow us to keep monitoring that safety. Of course, that it is still possible that even going through these different phases of clinical trial, by the time we go to a phase 3, we still haven't learned everything there is to learn about a specific drug. And so, there might be some safety signals that pop up. A patient, in, Nebraska may come up with a side effect. Well, they are reporting systems that we're mandated to follow as clinical investigators, where if anything unusual, even mild comes up in our patients, we report it to the study sponsor. And if something severe enough comes up, they might be, there are protection that are in place and systems that are in place so that, sometimes even studies are paused because of safety concerns, right? So there's kind of this chain of compliance and careful design that really allow for clinical investigators to protect their patients in the context of this trial. And through this active monitoring and reporting, then we're able to, prevent, a side effect that was not detected earlier from just affecting a large amount of patients.
That's really good to know. I am going to pivot again to another general question for Leorah, and actually this has already come up in the chat, so I'm glad we're going to talk about it. Who can join a clinical trial?
So I mean, the way we look at it, that we want everybody to participate in research. But now that doesn't mean that every trial is for everyone. But I'm pretty convinced with the amount of research that there is in MS, there's probably a trial for about everybody. If you look around and if you know where to look, right? Each study will have its own eligibility criteria. What we call eligibility criteria are these specific guidelines that decide who can be enrolled, who is, can participate in a way that is safe and that is appropriate. So sometimes that includes factors such as age or type of MS, relapsing, remitting, or progressive. Sometimes, we want people who have not been on certain medications in the past or who don't have certain conditions. That's not really meant to exclude people, though in the end it does exclude some people from certain trials, but it's meant to make sure that the results that we obtain for the trials are valid, and that the people that are in the trial are kept safe. So that's part of the conversation when, as a clinical investigator, I see patients in the clinic and I know that we're running some studies and enrolling, then I will, make sure I will talk to my patients about different studies that they might be eligible for. They may not be eligible for a drug trial because they don't meet those sometimes restrictive criteria, but they may be eligible for a registry that often have much wider, criteria, because we want to understand the experience of large groups of people through registry, for example. So I think the kind of the best way, and I think Ali said that earlier, is like talk to your doctor, look on the websites of different organizations, look at clinicaltrials.gov, which is a website where all trials are and studies are listed, for example. Because even though not every trial is for everyone, there is a trial for everybody out there.
We have had 5 questions and counting
And
about
I see this question from
age
the
restrictions. Yeah.
yeah, so it's do other, somebody asked in the Q&A, do other chronic health condition make me ineligible for participating in MS studies?
Mm.
Not all MS studies, so some, for instance, sometimes with particularly drug trials, they will restrict if somebody has uncontrolled kidney disease, for example. You can understand that giving you a medication where we don't yet know all the safety signals might be difficult to offer to someone who has chronic kidney disease, so those trials may be restricted to people who don't have certain conditions. But as I said, there are other types of research that may not even be interventional at all, that may be observational or experience, related kind of study, or implementation trials that may be more adapted to people that have certain conditions. So it's always a matter of kind of looking at what you can participate in.
So there's been specific questions about age restrictions, and it's sounding like women who feel like they are just past the age limit for eligibility, and they're wondering where they can go because they really want to be involved. So we've had 5 questions about that. So do you have any
Yeah,
specific examples of that,
yeah.
of where to go?
Yeah, the question of age is really important. And the reason why so many of the drug trials in particular have been restricted in age is because a lot of the drugs that we've been testing in MS focus on relapses, as an endpoint. We want to decrease relapses and new lesions. And we know that, as people age, we see much less relapses in the real world. So including people who are older may not allow the researcher to detect the signal that they need. If already people are kind of phasing out of having relapses, it's hard to show that a treatment is doing much better than age itself. So that's why a lot of the drug trials have been limited to younger patients who tend to have more attacks, so that we have more signal to look at. But there's been a real focus in the MS community to be more inclusive of people as they get older, because again, we know the disease change. We want to account for everybody's experience. And we know we want to learn how to treat MS across the lifespan. So I would say that while certain phase 3 trials may not be open to people above the age of 60, 65 these days, there are a lot of studies that are either phase 4 studies or registry-based study, observational studies that will not have age restrictions, or studies that look at certain biomarkers or look at certain digital apps or intervention, for example. Those may not be limited by age. So a great resource is, of course, always talk to your doctor. But I'll also want to point out to, against clinicaltrials.gov. It's, a national repository of clinical studies. And also, websites like MSAA or National MS Society may have information about certain trials in certain areas. So, but always start with your doctor. Sometimes, people like me, there may be a study that I'm not doing, but I know that a center down the street might be doing, or somebody in another city in my state might be doing, or that there's this big study happening that's remote, for example, where people can enroll without even leaving their home.
Mhm.
So just start with your doctor, but then also check out clinicaltrials.gov.
Thank you for that. All right, again, pivoting. Here we go. We've talked about this in different ways, but I want to directly talk about what the benefits are for participating in a clinical trial. What do I get
Yeah.
out of it?
Yeah, and it's true. I think that the first, for me, obvious that I see every day in clinic is that people who participate in research often have this, sense of purpose and empowerment that comes from being a part of something bigger, like being a part of advancing the care for future generations of people with MS. I think that's a deeply personal feeling, something we can't quantify, but that's something that's really important. Something also that's really that I experience every day as being a part of my team, where we have, 3 research coordinator, a research nurse, is that I see how much support, whatever research study you're participating in, our participants who are engaged in research have more people on their team because they have our clinical research team as part of their team. And so they really feel more supported. They have new sets of eyes on them. They have somebody they can reach out sometimes, very easily if they have a quick question or quick concern. And, I know how much joy that our research coordinators kind of bring to our patients by being accessible and just listening ears. So I think that's really a true benefit. Then some of the obvious is that, if you decide to engage in a study where you're testing a new treatment or testing a new intervention, whether it is new exercise, new lifestyle intervention, or other, then you get access to innovation before it's
Mhm.
available to everybody else. And so that can, be, an incentive for folks. Of course, you have to weigh this, there are risks and benefits to research and see if that is worth it for you, to be a part of this innovation. But that's kind of a big benefit also of being a part of research.
Yeah, I'll speak just as someone with MS. I think that I like the idea of a sense of purpose. And then I also just like the empowerment that can come with it, because living with MS can feel like you have zero control over anything. And participating in something like this and opting into this, you have control over that decision. And it gives you a little bit of sense of control in something that can kind of feel all over the place at times. So for
Yeah.
me, that would also be very
Yeah, thank you for
intriguing.
sharing that. Yeah, it's great to hear it from the participant perspective, because of course I see a lot of patients, but I don't live in their shoes. So it's great to hear from your perspective that you feel that sense of empowerment, as much as we see it from the clinician side.
Yeah. Ollie, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Leora said. I think that forming a part of a research study or a clinical research trial can be extremely empowering. I think it's a beautiful place to kind of feel like you have a sense of community, because even if you're just meeting with your coordinator or with your, other coordinator, or maybe with your physician, you do, like Leora said, know that you're part of something bigger. And I think Leora mentioned this a few times, but the relationship that you're able to create with your coordinator is so wonderful. Like, I can speak for myself in what I love about being a research coordinator. And it is honestly just being able to listen to the stories of people living with MS. You would be surprised at how much I love listening, or how much any coordinator loves listening. I think it's extremely beautiful. I think it's extremely empowering. I think it's a very vulnerable place to be um, in a position where you can talk to someone routinely about your disease, about your daily life, about things you struggle with, or things that you're extremely excited about. So I think it's really, really wonderful having someone that understands your MS apart from your provider, that is a lot more accessible. Because maybe you see your provider every 6 months or every year, but you can talk to your coordinator every week or see them every 3 months, and they kind of see your highs and your lows. And I think it's a really, really wonderful thing to have someone that can experience that with you and sit with you in those moments and cheer you on and just watch you grow. So yeah, I think there's a lot of beautiful things that can come with being part of research.
I seriously hadn't even considered that component of building community, and I love that so much. That's so great.
Yeah.
Okay, Leora, can you give us another example of how a non-drug study contributes to improving care?
Yeah, I mean, there's so we talked earlier, we talked about non-drug interventions,
Mhm.
like lifestyle interventions. We talked about biomarkers. We talked about digital tools, for example. Um, something that I've been personally very interested in has been research that has focused on care delivery. It's, we test kind of interventions, we test different things, but then how does the real world care happen? And how does the real world care impact outcomes? Because there's sometimes, we have these grandiose ideas like, there's this big innovation that's wonderful, but then sometimes innovations are not necessarily applied in the real world. So studying how, care is delivered, so for instance, my group, we do a lot of work in the state of Texas to understand the state of the state, and through my clinic, because I treat people this way, I know that a lot of my patients are on high efficacy treatments and have really good outcomes. But what happens at the state of a state like Texas? And then we learn through this kind of care delivery research, we can learn about the gaps in care that exist. When you look at a broader community, we know that, less than 50% of people in Texas are on disease modifying therapies. That they're really kind of really important gaps to bridge. And so that gives us kind of more data, more information for us to be able to find ways to change, to address those problems and barriers. So that's kind of a way, kind of more on like the healthcare delivery side. Another thing, so you mentioned earlier, kind of our collaboration around the MS implementation network, and so I would be, remiss to not, mention, implementation research. And that's kind of something that people don't always know about or understand. So I'm going to try to kind of break it down in a way that's easy. Um, so in clinical research, we try to test if new innovations work. So let's say I'm a researcher and I have this idea for a new exercise to improve spasticity for people with MS. Well, I may do a traditional clinical trial where I'm going to test my exercise program. I'm going to measure people's spasticity and I'm going to see how it works. And then, brilliant, my clinical trial works. And I have demonstrated that my exercise program works at treating spasticity. Well, does that mean that all of a sudden everybody with spasticity, that have MS and spasticity, have access to my program and can, implement it in the real world? No, I've just demonstrated that it works. Implementation research, implementation trials is what's going to try to answer the question of how can we make this innovation work in everyday practice, in the everyday world. And that's often there's a huge gap. People are really good at coming up with new innovations, but making those innovation, making those innovation accessible and work for people in the real world becomes the real problem. So through implementation research, then we can kind of bridge that gap. So we're not necessarily testing a drug, we're testing how innovations kind of work in the real world. So we look at different strategies, so for instance, my exercise program for spasticity, do I need to create educational material? Do I need new digital tool to make it accessible? Can I make it accessible through PT clinics or through the YMCA? Where is it going to work? And then the implementation study component is going to be testing those different strategies to see if they work, what works best to make my innovation work for as many people as possible in the real world. So that's kind of another type of research we don't often talk about. We often think about demonstrating that innovations work, but we don't often think about the research that's needed to make those innovations work in the real world for as many people as possible.
Thank you for that. We are actually coming close on time. So I am going to run through a couple more questions just so that we try to cover all of our bases here tonight. So forgive me that this feels scattered, but Ollie, this one's for you. If I participate, am I obligated to take part in the clinical trial for everything?
Good question. So the answer is no. Participation in any research study, clinical research trial is always completely voluntary. And that goes from the second that we tell you about it in the clinic and just tell you all the information and show you the consent. You're always more than welcome to decline and say no, and you don't have to give us any explanation. It's always just that's how research goes. And also, if you do decide to join a study and you are enrolled, you are always more than welcome to opt out without any questions asked. I think there's a common misconception or fear from participants sometimes that if they decide that they no longer want to do it, then their provider or their coordinator will be disappointed or their care will change in the clinic, and that is just completely never the case and will never be the case. I think research always prioritizes the patient, and we always want people who want to be involved and want to, do all the stuff necessary in the study. But we always want everyone to know that it's always an option to opt out, and yeah, that you just have complete freedom. So,
I appreciate that. I mean, I feel like we all want to be good patients and not a burden. But I like that, you all are expecting that people are going to opt out at certain points.
yeah,
And it's not a disappointment and it won't change care. So I think that's a really good thing to reiterate.
exactly.
Okay, and then I'm gonna stick with you. What are the things that I should consider before joining a trial?
Um, So I think there's a few things to consider, but I would say the most important thing to consider is time commitment, and what the study requires of you. So like we've said, there's a ton of different types of studies. Some of them can have a lot of involvement where you have to be coming into the clinic, getting MRIs, getting blood draws, having follow-ups in person. There's also other studies that only require surveys be sent out to you every 3 months, every 6 months. And those studies can range from like 5 minutes to 30 minutes. So I think it's always important to consider your bandwidth and what you have time for and what you can actually do in the study. So if you think that you would love to do it, but there's no way that you can come in person, and the study requires you to be in person, then I think that's something to consider. But I think it's also great when we have telehealth options available and things like that. And then you can actually be part of the study without there being much of a time commitment. I think another thing to consider is always just that you want to be a part of the study and not that you ever feel pressured to be a part of the study. I think when you have that sense of purpose in what you're being involved in, then it's a lot easier to just look forward to these visits and do the surveys and not feel like anything is a burden because we never want anything to feel like it's a burden. So I would say those are the main things. Just know what the study requires, the time it requires, if there's resources available, maybe like telehealth or a driving compensation or things like that. And just to make sure that you really want to be part of the study and that, no one's forcing you to. So
Mhm. Just be honest with what you can
yeah,
handle.
exactly.
And I think with MS, I would be considering fatigue when I was asking myself that question.
Oh, 100%. And I think there's also things like it's peak summer and you're requiring like a
Right.
walk, and that's really hard for people with MS. So I think there's so many things to consider and only you know you best. And
Mhm.
so it's always just good to be honest with yourself and with your team.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Leora, what are common misconceptions about clinical trials?
I think the biggest misconception is people who feel like their research is, you know, makes them guinea pigs. That research is makes you kind of somebody who has no choice, no freedom. That we're just going to study you without prioritizing you. And I think that's definitely kind of the greatest misconception. I think that there's been so many efforts over the last century to make clinical trials safe, to also improve the experience of participants in clinical trials, through, support for, sometimes transportation, through compensation, through very different things to really acknowledge that, it's a commitment to be a part of research,
Mhm.
and a choice that we're so glad you're making, to help advance the field. So I think that's kind of like the first misconception, I would say. A second misconception is we talked a little bit about it earlier, is that, well, if I don't want to change my treatment, then I cannot participate in any research. Again, we talked a lot about this today. Like, there are a lot of research that is not investigational, that is not drug, that there are a lot of ways that you advance the field, a lot of ways that you can participate. So that's also kind of, and I'm glad Ale talked about this just now. It's like the commitment that research is very involved. Well, there are some research studies that are just not very involved, that can be done remotely, just completing surveys, but that still advance the understanding of the disease, and still brings your voice to the field. And that's super important. Also some, people, and I've saw this in some of the questions, I believe that, research is only for certain people with MS, either people who are young or people who don't have comorbidities or people who have just a certain type of MS. And while this can be restrictive in some drug trials, again, the scope of research is much broader. And I believe there's a study for everyone that can help them be a part of this movement.
One thing that came up for me while you were explaining that, Leorah, was that I didn't know before starting in my current role how about the big push in this space for people living with the condition to be involved in the creation of the research and the monitoring of the data and all of that. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think this is one of the greatest thing and greatest advances is really this motivation in the scientific community to not just, have our patients be participants in research, but to become active designers of this whole research. So there's more and more initiatives to bring people living with MS and living with any condition to the table as research trials or research studies are designed. So often every big study has steering committees or councils, advisory councils, where we engage with people who have lived experience and participate in really designing the trial. We talk a lot about research burden. Well, how can, sometimes research burden can exclude certain people from research. Let's say people who, live, have a difficult life, or they are single mothers who are also working outside the home, who cannot miss work. Well, how can we make research more accessible to people like her? By having transportation, childcare, compensation, and this is all brought by bringing the patient voice at the center and bringing people in building all those little building blocks that are necessary to create these research opportunities. So I think this is a very exciting development. I know that as part of the MS Implementation Network, we engage, we have people living with MS as part of our steering committee. We engage with people, with lived experience, and also, advocacy groups as part of our council. And truly, that's kind of one of the most beautiful part of being a part of that initiative.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be part of it. I've had the opportunity to be part of a couple other things where I get to use my patient voice for research, and it's just so nice and rewarding. And so look for those opportunities as well.
Yep.
I think we've got 4 minutes. So Leorah, I really want to make sure I have time for this question, which is how do trials reflect diversity and inclusion in MS care?
Yeah, and this is something that, we've had, I think, a reckoning about over the last, 5 years. Is that historically clinical trials have not really reflected the full diversity of people with MS. And I can speak to this kind of from, even my own experience. My team led a study where we looked at all the phase 3 trials, those big trials of disease modifying therapies. And we did what we call a systematic review, where we dived into the data in depth and systematically. And we looked at 44, trials, phase 3 trial publications. And what we found was that historically, first, people didn't report, for instance, race and ethnicity properly. Some trials didn't even report the race and ethnicity of their participants. Some only talked about the percentage of people who are white. And only a third really reported the full diversity. We also found that, historically, those trials have not been inclusive of people of all backgrounds. So we've found very small participants were Black, for example, and definitely an underrepresentation compared to what is seen in the real world and in our communities. And that has an impact on how can we generalize findings. And also when we talk about the benefits of research, how can we spread the good around to all communities of patients. So we definitely have had a reckoning about this. There's been a lot of data, a lot of publications about the lack of diversity of MS trials, particularly drug trials, and that has led to those intentional efforts to reach to those underrepresented populations, to design specific studies in partnership with people from these communities to be able to reduce the barriers to research participation, to be able to bring more folks into trials, to build the trust that's needed so that they can feel safe and feel a part of this movement that is clinical research. So I think this is slowly changing. As those initiatives to bring underrepresented communities into clinical research come to fruition. So my hope is that as we move forward, we're going to see more and more diversity and inclusion. Sometimes we cannot, we talked also about diversity and inclusion, not just from a racial and ethnic perspective, but also from an age perspective or a disability perspective, wanting all people, to be included in research. Sometimes that is difficult for reasons that I mentioned earlier in some trials, but a lot of us that are clinician researchers also speak to, industry and pharma to try to, if not being able to include the full spectrum of people with MS, in terms of age, for example, into the phase 3 trials, how can we make sure that in the phase 4 studies, we're really studying their outcomes more specifically, that we learn more about how they're doing. So it can take, I don't see that we're gonna in the future have phase 3 trials that represent all people with MS necessarily due to certain constraints, but there's definitely efforts to get there, and there's certainly efforts to then focus research on the populations that need them.
Thank you for that, Leorah. I'm really glad that we were able to cover that. We have reached our hour, and it looks like we have generated some excitement in the chat. So I'm going to answer one quick question before we sign off. And that question is, can I enroll in more than one clinical trial at once? The answer is yes, and you need to talk to an LA to see if that will work for you. And I think, is there anything else that you two would like to add to that really quick before we close?
No, to that specifically, the answer is probably yes. I think again, it's very dependent on the studies,
On
but
the study.
but we've had various patients that are part of 2 of our studies. So if it's definitely a
It's
possibility.
definitely possible. It may
Yeah.
not be possible for certain studies to
Exactly.
also be engaged, in 2 at once.
Yeah,
But there's definitely nothing that prevents you from, participating in survey studies or observational studies registry while you're also participating in others, for example.
exactly.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Leorah and Ale, and for all of you for being here with us. Clinical research is such an important part of improving MS care, and today's conversation helps remind us that progress doesn't happen in isolation. It happens because of the people who choose to get involved. This concludes our webinar, and on behalf of MSAA, we want to thank you for your time and participation. Just a reminder, this program was recorded and will be archived on MSAA's website in the upcoming weeks. Please also take a few minutes to complete the brief survey. We would absolutely love your feedback. Thank you again and have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye.